The silent hero begins with me, Arthur Artie Vance. To the people walking by on the busy streets of Chicago, I'm just a man in a tattered coat living in a reinforced cardboard structure tucked into an alleyway. They see the weathered boxes and the duct tape, but they do not see the solar-powered heating unit I built from discarded scraps or the high-speed satellite uplink hidden in the double-walled insulation. My background is in structural engineering and high-frequency logistics. I spent 30 years building the skyline everyone admires, but I chose this life to stay close to the ground and watch how the city really breathes. My skill is seeing the things others ignore, from a loose bolt on a bridge to the hidden pain in a stranger's eyes. The villain of my story is Julian Vane. He is a young, flashy real estate developer who treats the city like his personal monopoly board. He wants the corner where I live because it is the final piece of his Vane legacy tower. He calls me an eyesore and a parasite. He comes by in his $4,000 suits just to kick my cardboard walls and laugh. He tells me that by Friday, he will have the police sweep me away like the morning trash. I just look up at him and smile, because I know something he doesn't. I know that the land he thinks he's buying is tied up in a trust that only one person can unlock. The first act ends when Julian leans down and whispers that if the city won't move me, he will hire men who don't wear uniforms to do it for him. The person I save is Evelyn Thorne. She is the matriarch of the Thorne family and one of the most respected philanthropists in the country. On a rainy Tuesday night, her driver suffers a medical emergency and their car hydroplanes right into a concrete pillar near my alley. While others stand back and film with their phones, I use a hydraulic jack I fashioned from an old truck lift to pry the crushed door open before the engine fire spreads. I pull Evelyn to safety and stay with her, holding her hand and telling her stories of the old city until the ambulance arrives. When she finds out I live in the cardboard house, she tries to write me a check for $5 million on the spot. I gently push her hand away. I tell her I don't want her money, but I do want her to help me with a very special project. The second act ends when I tell her the project requires her to show up at my cardboard house on Friday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, dressed for a celebration. The altruistic request I make is for Evelyn to help me establish the Vance Garden of Grace. Instead of a cold glass skyscraper, I want to turn this entire block into a state-of-the-art community sanctuary. It will have micro-housing units that look like modern art, a free medical clinic, and a training center where people can learn the same engineering skills that made me my secret fortune. I have the billions of dollars to pay for it, but I need her political influence and her reputation to bypass the corrupt city council members that Julian Vane has in his pocket. The story concludes with the ultimate reveal. Julian Vane arrives on Friday morning with a bulldozer and a crew of men ready to tear down my home. He is gloating, telling me my time is up. But then a fleet of black cars pulls up. Evelyn Thorne steps out, followed by the mayor and the chief of police. Julian tries to charm them, telling them he is clearing the way for progress. That is when I step out of my cardboard house, wearing a suit that cost more than his entire car. I hand him the legal deed to the land and the blueprints for the Garden of Grace. I watch the color drain from his face as he realizes I am the silent majority shareholder of the very bank that holds his company's debt. The final cliffhanger arrives when I tell Julian that since he loves this corner so much, I have a special job for him. He can be the one to hand-plant every single flower in the new garden, or he can face the fraud charges I've been documenting for the last 6 months. The screech of tires on wet pavement was the only warning before the silver Mercedes slammed into the concrete pillar, sending a cloud of steam and sparks into the freezing night air. While the crowd stood back, clutching their phones and recording the tragedy, I crawled out from my cardboard shelter. The smell of burning rubber and expensive perfume filled the air as the driver realized the only person moving to save them was the man they had spent months trying to erase from the sidewalk. Subscribe and comment where you are watching from, because the person everyone ignored saved someone else's entire world. The freezing wind whipped around the corner of 5th and Main, cutting through my old wool coat like a knife. Most people see this spot as a shortcut to the subway, but for me, it is the best seat in the house. My home is a masterpiece of engineering, though you wouldn't know it by looking at the duct tape and the faded logos of appliance boxes. I call it my castle. I have been here for 3 years, watching the world spin by from the ground up. You learn a lot about people when they think you are invisible. You see the businessman who kicks a stray cat when no one is looking, and you see the little girl who shares half her sandwich with a pigeon. I see it all. Julian Vane is the kind of man who thinks the world is his personal plaything. He is young, maybe 30, and always smells like expensive cologne and arrogance. He is building the Vane Legacy Tower right across the street, a glass and steel monstrosity that he thinks will make him immortal. But my little corner of the world is in his way. He wants the city to clear me out. Every morning, he stops by in his shiny car, just to remind me how insignificant I am. He calls me a stain on his view. He tells me that people like me are the reason the city is rotting. I just sit there on my milk crate, sipping my lukewarm coffee, and I smile. I smile because I know the secrets of the soil he is trying to build on. I know that beneath his feet, the foundations are shifting, and he is too busy looking at his own reflection in the windows to notice. The rain started as a light drizzle but quickly turned into a freezing downpour. The asphalt turned into a mirror, reflecting the neon signs of the diners and the blinking traffic lights. It was the kind of night where the city feels heavy and tired. I was tucking a fresh layer of plastic over my roof when I heard it. The high-pitched whine of an engine pushed too hard on a slick road. A silver Mercedes came flying around the bend, its headlights cutting through the dark like two desperate eyes. The driver hit a patch of black ice, and the car spun. It was like watching a movie in slow motion. The heavy metal frame slid across the 3 lanes of traffic, heading straight for the massive concrete support pillar of the overpass. The sound of the impact was deafening. It wasn't just a crash. It was the sound of metal being folded like paper. Glass shattered and rained down on the pavement like diamonds. For a second, everything went silent. Then, the smoke started to rise from the crumpled hood. A few people stopped their cars further down the road. I saw them step out, but they didn't run toward the wreckage. They pulled out their phones. They started filming. They wanted to be the first to post the tragedy, to get the likes and the comments. They didn't see the flicker of orange flame licking at the bottom of the engine block. I didn't think. I just moved. My knees cracked as I stood up, but my hands were steady. I grabbed the hydraulic jack I had modified from an old garbage truck lift. It was heavy, but it was reliable. I ran across the street, the cold rain soaking my hair and my clothes. As I got closer, I could hear a faint moaning from inside the car. The airbags had deployed, filling the cabin with white dust. The smell of gasoline was getting stronger. I knew I only had a few minutes before the whole thing went up. I reached the driver's side door, but it was jammed tight against the pillar. I moved to the passenger side. I saw a woman in the back seat. She looked like she belonged in a palace, not a wreck. Her hair was silver and perfectly coiffed, though now it was stained with a thin trickle of blood from her forehead. She looked at me through the cracked window, her eyes wide with terror. She saw my tattered coat and my unkempt beard, and for a split second I saw her flinch. She thought I was there to hurt her or rob her. But then she saw my eyes. I leaned in close to the glass and spoke in the calm, steady voice I used to use when I led engineering teams across the globe. I told her to breathe. I told her that I was going to get her out. I set the jack against the frame of the door and started to pump. The metal groaned and protested, but I knew exactly where the pressure points were. I knew the structural integrity of that car better than the people who sold it. With a loud snap, the door popped open. The heat from the engine was intense now. I reached in and unbuckled her seatbelt. She was shaking so hard she couldn't move her legs. I lifted her out of the seat, surprising myself with the strength left in my old bones. I carried her away from the car, back toward the safety of my alley. We were only 20 feet away when the gas tank caught. The explosion knocked us both forward. I shielded her body with mine as the heat washed over us. The people with the phones finally started to scream and run away, but we were already safe. I sat her down on my milk crate and wrapped my best wool blanket around her shoulders. She was staring at the burning car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at me, then at the cardboard house behind me, and then back at the fire. She realized that the man she might have looked down on an hour ago was the only reason she was still breathing. She reached out and grabbed my hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. She tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I just patted her hand and told her to stay quiet until the paramedics arrived. I could hear the sirens in the distance, a low wail that was getting louder by the second. As the red and blue lights began to bounce off the wet walls of the alley, a black SUV pulled up onto the curb, nearly hitting a fire hydrant. Julian Vane jumped out, looking frantic. He wasn't worried about the woman. He was looking at the wreckage and the fire, worried about the bad publicity for his construction site. He didn't even see the woman sitting in the shadows of my home. He marched over to me, his face twisted in a sneer, ready to blame me for the chaos on his street. He didn't realize that the woman I had just saved was the one person in the world who could take everything he owned away with a single phone call. The sirens were deafening now, and the first ambulance screeched to a halt. Julian was shouting at me, pointing his finger and demanding to know what I had done to his street. He was so caught up in his own anger that he didn't notice the silver-haired woman standing up from the milk crate. She pushed the blanket off her shoulders and stood tall, even with the blood on her face. She looked at Julian with a cold, sharp gaze that would have frozen a volcano. The look on Julian's face when he realized who she was would have been funny if the situation wasn't so serious. His jaw dropped, and he actually took a step back, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He tried to stammer out an apology, but she wasn't listening. She turned back to me, ignoring the billionaire developer as if he were the one who was invisible. She reached into her small silk purse and pulled out a gold pen and a piece of paper. But I shook my head before she could write a single word. I told her I didn't want a reward. I told her I wanted justice. The look of confusion on her face was quickly replaced by a spark of interest as I pointed toward the massive construction site across the street. I told her that if she really wanted to thank me, she would help me build something that actually mattered. The first act ends as a dark, heavy car with government plates pulls up behind the ambulance, and a man in a dark suit steps out, looking directly at me with a look of recognition that chills my blood. He knows exactly who I am, and he hasn't been looking for me to say thank you. The sun doesn't really rise in the city. It just sort of leaks down the sides of the skyscrapers until it hits the pavement. I usually wake up around 5 in the morning, right when the first delivery trucks start their heavy rumble down the street. It is a sound most people hate, but to me, it is the heartbeat of the world. I sat up in my shelter, which from the outside looks like a messy pile of discarded refrigerator boxes and heavy-duty blue tarps held together with layers of silver duct tape. To the thousands of people who rush past me every day on their way to high-powered jobs, I am just a part of the urban landscape they try not to notice. They see the weathered cardboard and the old wool blanket, and they look away. They don't see the triple-layered insulation I built into the walls, or the small, silent ventilation system I rigged from a computer cooling fan and a portable battery. I crawled out and began my morning ritual. I like to keep my little corner of the sidewalk clean. I have an old broom with half the bristles missing, but it does the job. I swept the cigarette butts and the candy wrappers into a neat pile. There is a certain dignity in order, even when you live on a street corner. I've always believed that how you treat your space says everything about who you are. My name is Arthur Vance, though most of the regulars around here just call me Artie. I used to design the very buildings that now cast long shadows over my head. I spent decades calculating the load-bearing capacity of steel and the wind resistance of glass. Now I spend my time calculating the kindness of strangers and the structural integrity of a well-placed cardboard flap. By 6:30, the morning rush was in full swing. I sat on my favorite milk crate and watched the parade. There is a young woman who always walks by with a frantic look on her face and a lukewarm latte in her hand. I know she's a junior lawyer because she carries a briefcase that is far too heavy for her small frame, and she is always rehearsing opening statements under her breath. Then there is the older gentleman who walks his golden retriever every morning at 7. He always gives me a polite nod, the kind one gentleman gives another, and it makes me feel like I'm still a part of the human race. It's the small things that keep you anchored when the world tries to drift away from you. But then, the mood changed. The air usually smells like diesel and stale coffee, but suddenly a sharp, expensive scent cut through the grime. I didn't even have to look up to know that Julian Vane had arrived. The sound of his Italian loafers clicking on the concrete was unmistakable. It was a sharp, aggressive sound, like someone trying to stab the ground with every step. Julian is the golden boy of the Vane Development Group. He's the kind of man who wears a 3-piece suit in the middle of a heat wave just to show everyone he can afford the dry cleaning bill. I watched him step out of his silver sports car, which he had illegally parked right in front of a fire hydrant. He didn't care. He probably looked at the parking ticket as a small fee for his own convenience. He marched over to my shelter, his face twisted in a look of pure disgust. He didn't see a man. He saw a blemish on his perfect vision of the future. He reached out with one polished shoe and gave the corner of my cardboard house a sharp kick. I felt the vibration through the ground, but I didn't move. I just kept my eyes on the horizon, waiting for him to speak. "Well, Artie," he said, his voice dripping with a fake sort of friendliness that was worse than an insult. "I see you're still decorating the neighborhood with your trash. I've got some news for you. The City Council finally signed off on the final permits for the Vane Legacy Tower. This entire block is going to be glass and chrome by this time next year, and that means you and your little craft project have to go. I'm giving you until Friday. After that, I'm bringing in the heavy machinery, and I won't be checking to see if anyone is taking a nap inside those boxes." I looked up at him then. I noticed a small bead of sweat on his upper lip, despite the expensive air conditioning he'd just stepped out of. He was nervous, though he would never admit it. He was behind schedule, and he was over budget. I knew this because I'd been watching the surveyors for weeks. I saw where they placed their markers, and I knew they were off by at least 3 inches on the eastern boundary. In the world of high-rise construction, 3 inches is a mile. It's the difference between a building that stands for a century and one that starts to groan after 5 years. I smiled at him, a slow, warm smile that always seemed to irritate him more than a curse word ever could. "It's a beautiful morning, Julian," I said quietly. "You should try to enjoy the air before you fill it with all that dust. The city has a way of surprising you. Sometimes, the things you think are the weakest are actually the ones holding everything together." Julian laughed, a harsh, dry sound that had no joy in it. "You're a philosopher now? That's rich. You're a man living in a box, Artie. You have nothing. You are nothing. On Friday, the world moves on, and you'll just be a memory that gets swept into a dumpster." He turned on his heel and walked back to his car, leaving a cloud of expensive cologne in his wake. I watched him drive away, weaving through traffic with a reckless disregard for anyone else on the road. I reached into the hidden pocket of my coat and pulled out a small, rugged tablet that looked like it had been through a war. It was a custom-built piece of hardware, encrypted and linked to a private satellite network I'd set up years ago. I tapped the screen, and a series of complex architectural drawings appeared. They were the blueprints for the Vane Legacy Tower. I had found a back door into their server months ago, not to steal, but to observe. As I scrolled through the structural layers, I saw exactly what I had suspected. Julian was cutting corners. He was using a cheaper grade of reinforced concrete for the foundation, thinking no one would ever notice once the pretty glass was slapped on top. He was gambling with the lives of everyone who would eventually work in that building just to pad his own profit margins. He thought he was the smartest man in the room because he had the biggest bank account. He didn't realize that I wasn't just some old man living in a box because I had nowhere else to go. I looked down at the sidewalk, at the exact spot where the surveyors had placed their mark. I knew that beneath the concrete, there was an old underground stream that the city had forgotten about back in the 1920s. If Julian poured that cheap concrete over that shifting soil, the whole tower would start to tilt before they even reached the 10th floor. I could have told him. I could have saved him hundreds of millions of dollars. But Julian didn't want my advice. He wanted me gone. I tucked the tablet back into my coat and took a sip of my water. The sun was higher now, and the city was getting louder. I felt a strange sense of peace. Most people think that power is found in skyscrapers and boardrooms, but real power is knowing the truth when everyone else is living a lie. Julian thought he was the one in control, but he was just a man building a house of cards on a windy day. I leaned back against my cardboard wall and closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the hum of the city. I wasn't worried about Friday. I wasn't worried about the bulldozers or the men in uniforms. I knew something that Julian Vane would never understand. I knew that the land he was so desperate to build on wasn't owned by the city, and it wasn't owned by his family's trust. It was held in a private endowment that had been dormant for 30 years, waiting for a specific set of fingerprints to wake it up. As I felt the familiar weight of the heavy brass key hidden in the lining of my boot, I realized that the show was just beginning. The world saw a homeless man, but the bank's digital vault was about to see its primary owner for the first time in 3 decades. Just as I was about to settle in for a nap, a black car with tinted windows pulled up to the curb, and a man I hadn't seen in 20 years stepped out, looking directly at my cardboard home with an expression of pure shock. The rain started coming down in heavy, freezing sheets just as the streetlights flickered to life. It was one of those cold, biting Chicago rains that makes everyone duck their heads and scurry for cover as fast as they can. I was busy securing a heavy waterproof tarp over my ventilation intake when the sound of the city changed. Usually, it is a low, constant hum of engines and distant voices, but this was the high-pitched scream of tires losing their grip on the slick, black pavement. I looked up just in time to see a silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class dancing across the 3 lanes of traffic like a ghost on ice. It was moving far too fast for the conditions, and the driver was clearly overcorrecting in a panic. The impact was a sound I will never forget as long as I live. It was a deep, metallic crunch that vibrated through the very soles of my boots. The car slammed sideways into a massive concrete support pillar for the elevated train tracks right across from my alley. Glass shattered and sprayed across the road like a million tiny, sparkling diamonds. Steam began to hiss from the crumpled hood immediately, and for a long, terrifying moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. I did not wait for the sirens. I did not wait to see if someone else would step up to help. I saw other cars slowing down and stopping, but the people inside were not running toward the wreckage. They were pulling out their smartphones. I saw the eerie glow of dozens of screens through the rain as people started recording the scene, looking for their 15 minutes of internet fame while a human being was trapped inside a cage of twisted steel and broken glass. It made my stomach turn with a mix of anger and sadness, but it also made me move faster than I have in years. I reached under the false floor of my shelter and grabbed my heavy-duty hydraulic spreader. It was a tool I had modified myself from old industrial parts, capable of putting out 10 tons of pressure with a few simple pumps. I ran across the street, my old wool coat flapping in the wind. The smell of gasoline was already thick and heavy in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of burnt rubber and ozone. As I got to the car, I saw the driver was unconscious, slumped over the steering wheel with the white airbag looking like a giant deflated pillow. But it was the person in the back seat who caught my eye and made my heart stop. It was an older woman, dressed in an elegant wool coat that probably cost more than a mid-sized suburban home. Her hair was perfectly white, but now it was matted with blood from a jagged cut on her temple. She was conscious, her eyes wide and glassy with shock. She was trying to push against the heavy door, but the concrete pillar had crushed the frame so tightly that the metal had fused together into a solid wall. I could see the first flickers of orange light dancing under the chassis near the ruptured fuel line. We had maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3, if the rain helped keep the heat down. I jammed the tip of the hydraulic spreader into the narrow gap between the door and the main frame. My muscles bunched and groaned under the weight, but I did not let up for a second. I started to pump the handle with everything I had, and the machine began to hiss with a steady, powerful rhythm. The metal of the Mercedes screamed as it was forced apart, the sound of tearing steel echoing against the buildings. The woman inside looked at me, and for a second, I saw her fear turn into pure, unadulterated confusion. She saw a man who looked like he had not had a proper haircut in a year, wearing a coat held together by luck and duct tape, using a piece of professional rescue equipment like he had been born to it. I did not say a single word to her. I just kept pumping. With a loud bone-jarring crack, the heavy door hinges finally snapped. I tossed the heavy spreader aside and reached into the smoke-filled cabin. The interior of the car was dangerously hot now, and the air was thick with the toxic smell of melting plastic and leather. I reached over and unbuckled her seatbelt, then gently pulled her out of the wreckage. She was much lighter than she looked, brittle and delicate like a small bird. I carried her in my arms, moving as fast as my old legs would carry me, back toward the safety of the sidewalk and the deep shadows of my alley. We were only 30 feet away when the gas tank finally caught fire. The explosion was a massive wall of heat that pushed us forward with incredible force. I felt the singe of the flames on the back of my neck as I shielded her body with my own, making sure she did not hit the hard ground. Behind us, the silver car was engulfed in a pillar of fire that lit up the entire street like it was midday. The heat was so intense it felt like it was peeling the skin off my back, but I did not let her go until we were behind the brick corner of the building. I sat her down on a concrete planter, wrapping my arms around her to stop her from shaking. She was gasping for air, looking at the fire with a mix of horror and total disbelief. I pulled a clean, white handkerchief from my inner pocket and pressed it gently against the cut on her head to stop the bleeding. Her hands were trembling violently as she reached up to hold the cloth in place. She looked me in the eyes, and for the first time, she really saw me. There was no judgment in her gaze, no looking down on the homeless man from the alley. There was only a deep, profound gratitude that transcended class or money. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling just as much as her hands. "You saved my life." Everyone else just stood there and watched. "Why did you help me when I have done nothing for you?" I gave her a small, tired smile and squeezed her hand. "Because it was the right thing to do," I said quietly. "And because I know exactly what it feels like to be trapped in a place where no one wants to look at you or help you." The sirens were deafening now, and the red and blue lights were reflecting off the wet buildings in a frantic rhythm. I saw a large black SUV pull up onto the curb, and a man I recognized instantly stepped out. His name was Marcus, and he had been my head of security 20 years ago when I still ran the company. He was looking at me with his mouth hanging open, his eyes darting between the burning wreckage and the woman I was holding. He started to run toward us, his face a mask of pure shock. I knew I could not stay another second. If Marcus found me and brought me into the light, my quiet, hidden life was over. My secrets would be all over the evening news by morning, and the peace I had built would be shattered. I stood up quickly and patted the woman on her shoulder. "You are going to be just fine now," I told her, as the first ambulance crew jumped out of their vehicle. "The professionals are right here to take care of you." I did not wait for her to respond or for her to ask my name. I did not wait for Marcus to reach us and start asking questions I was not ready to answer. I turned and disappeared into the deep shadows of the alleyway, weaving through the stacks of old crates and the back entrances of the restaurants I knew like the back of my hand. I moved with a quickness and a purpose that would have surprised anyone who saw me shuffling along the sidewalk during the day. I reached the back of my cardboard shelter and slipped inside, pulling the heavy tarp closed and locking the inner latch just as the first fire truck screeched to a halt in front of the wreckage. I sat there in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I could hear the absolute chaos outside, the shouting of the firefighters, the crackle of the flames, and the frantic, high-pitched voice of Julian Vane. He had apparently returned to the scene and was already trying to figure out how to spin the accident for his public relations team. I heard him complaining loudly to a police officer about how the fire and the investigation were going to delay his construction schedule by at least a week. The man did not even bother to ask if the passengers were alive or dead. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object I had scooped up from the floor of the car without even thinking about it during the rescue. It was a heavy platinum signet ring with a crest I recognized instantly. It belonged to the Thorne family. Evelyn Thorne was the woman I had just pulled from the fire. She was not just a wealthy woman, she was the most powerful philanthropist in the state. She owned more land and had more respect than Julian Vane could ever hope to buy. A few minutes later, I heard a heavy, deliberate knock on the side of my cardboard house. It was not the aggressive, disrespectful kick Julian usually gave. It was a respectful, measured tap that suggested the person on the other side knew exactly who was inside. I stayed perfectly silent, holding my breath and staying low to the ground. "I know you're in there, Arthur," a voice said through the cardboard. It was Marcus. He was standing right outside my wall. "I saw your face in the light of the fire. I would know that engineering grip anywhere in the world. You can try to hide from the rest of the world, but you cannot hide from me anymore. She wants to see you. She is refusing to go to the hospital until she speaks to the man in the tattered coat." I did not answer him. I just sat in the flickering shadows of the emergency lights, looking at the platinum ring in my hand. I knew that my time as a ghost was coming to an end. Julian Vane wanted me gone by Friday, but he had no idea that I now held the one thing that could dismantle his entire empire in a single afternoon. The cliffhanger arrived when I looked at my hidden computer screen and saw a notification flashing in bright red. Julian had not just been cutting corners on the building materials, he had been systematically embezzling from the city's teacher pension fund, and the final massive transfer was scheduled to happen tomorrow morning at dawn. If I did not act, thousands of people would lose their entire life savings. But if I did act, I would have to step out of the shadows and face the ghosts of the life I had left behind 30 years ago. The heat from the burning Mercedes was so intense, it felt like a physical wall pushing against my chest. I could hear the tires popping and the glass melting into strange, distorted shapes. My hands were stinging with a sharp, biting pain that I knew would turn into blisters by morning. I looked down at my palms and saw the skin was bright red and covered in soot. I had used my bare hands to pry back a piece of jagged, white-hot metal to get a better grip on Evelyn's seatbelt. In that moment, I didn't feel the burn. I didn't feel the age in my joints or the damp cold of the Chicago night. I only felt the desperate need to get that woman away from the flames. My coat, the heavy wool one I had spent 3 winters perfecting with hidden layers of insulation and reinforced stitching, was ruined. The back of it was scorched and blackened, smelling like a campfire gone wrong. It was more than just a piece of clothing to me. It was my armor. It was the thing that allowed me to blend into the shadows and disappear whenever I needed to. Now, it was a heavy, stinking weight hanging off my shoulders. I felt a pang of genuine loss for that old coat. It had been my constant companion through some of the loneliest nights of my life, but as I looked back at the woman I had saved, I knew the trade was worth it. A piece of wool for a human life is a bargain any day of the week. I crouched low behind a stack of wooden pallets at the mouth of my alley, watching the scene unfold from the darkness. My lungs felt like they were filled with hot sand. Every breath I took came with a ragged, wheezing sound that echoed against the brick walls. I tried to stay as still as possible, but the shivering started deep in my bones. It was the adrenaline leaving my system, replaced by the crushing reality of the cold and the pain. I watched the paramedics lift Evelyn onto a gurney. She was still looking around, her eyes searching the crowd for the man in the tattered coat. I saw Marcus, my old head of security, talking to a police officer. He was pointing toward my alley, his face pale and tight with worry. He knew I was close. He knew the way I moved, the way I always looked for the path of least resistance. I had to get back to my shelter. I had to become Artie, the homeless man again, before the cameras and the flashlights found me. I crawled on my hands and knees through the damp grime of the alley floor, moving behind trash bins and stacks of discarded tires. My knees were raw, and the wet pavement felt like ice against my skin. I reached the back entrance of my cardboard house and slipped inside through the hidden flap. I pulled the heavy tarp shut and fumbled for the latch with my shaking, burned fingers. The silence inside my little home was sudden and heavy. The sounds of the sirens and the shouting outside were muffled by the thick, insulated walls I had built. I sat there in the dark for a long time, just trying to breathe. The smell of smoke followed me inside, clinging to my hair and my skin. I reached up and touched my face, feeling the grit of the soot and the stickiness of the blood that wasn't mine. I had given up my invisibility tonight. I had stepped out of the role I had played for 30 years, and I knew there would be a price to pay for that. Once the world gets a glimpse of the person behind the mask, they never stop digging until they find the whole truth. I had spent decades making sure no one would ever find Arthur Vance, and in 5 minutes of fire and chaos, I had put all that work at risk. I pulled off the ruined wool coat and laid it on the floor. It was a sad-looking thing now, stiff and brittle from the heat. I reached into the secret inner pocket and pulled out my encrypted tablet. The screen glowed with a soft blue light that felt too bright for my tired eyes. I checked the security feed from the small hidden cameras I had placed around the perimeter of the block. I saw Julian Vane standing near the yellow police tape. He was talking on his cell phone, his face twisted in a sneer. He wasn't looking at the wreckage. He was looking at the spot where my cardboard house stood. He was pointing at it and shouting at a man in a high-visibility vest. I zoomed in on Julian's face. He looked like a man who was losing his grip on a situation he thought he controlled. He didn't care about the woman who almost died. He didn't care about the hero who saved her. He only cared that his construction site was now a crime scene and an accident investigation zone. I watched him reach into his pocket and hand a thick envelope to the man in the vest. It was a classic Julian move. A little bit of cash to make the problems go away. A little bit of grease for the wheels of the city's bureaucracy. I turned off the tablet and leaned my head back against the cardboard wall. My hands were throbbing now. A steady, rhythmic pulse of pain that made it hard to think. I reached for my first aid kit, a small metal box hidden under my sleeping mat. I pulled out a tube of burn cream and some clean gauze. It took me a long time to wrap my own hands. My fingers were clumsy and stiff, and I had to use my teeth to tear the tape. Every movement was a struggle, but I forced myself to finish. I couldn't go to a hospital. I couldn't risk the questions. I had to be self-sufficient, just like I had been since the day I walked away from my old life. By the time I was finished, the noise outside had started to fade. The fire trucks were packing up, and the crowd of onlookers had been pushed back by the police. The rain continued to fall, a steady rhythmic drumming on the roof of my house. It was a soothing sound, the kind of sound that usually helps me sleep, But sleep was a long way off tonight. I felt like a soldier returning to a foxhole after a brutal skirmish. Everything I owned was covered in ash. My sanctuary felt smaller than usual, more fragile. I realized that my cardboard walls couldn't protect me from the things that were coming. I lay down on my mat, pulling a spare blanket over my shoulders. My body was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I thought about Evelyn Thorne and the way she had looked at me. She hadn't seen a ghost or a legend. She had seen a man. And Marcus. He had seen a ghost he thought was long dead. I knew he wouldn't stop until he found me. He was loyal to a fault, and he would think he was doing me a favor by bringing me back into the world of light and luxury. He didn't understand that I liked the shadows. I liked the honesty of the street. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the sound of the rain. I told myself that tomorrow would be just another day. I would wake up at 5, sweep the sidewalk, and watch the city wake up. I would be Artie again, the invisible man on the corner. I would ignore the burns on my hands and the ache in my lungs. I would pretend that nothing had changed, but deep down, I knew the clock was ticking. Julian Vane wanted me gone by Friday, and now he had a reason to be even more aggressive. He didn't like witnesses, and he certainly didn't like people who made him look bad. Just as I was finally starting to drift off into a light, fitful sleep, I heard a sound that made my eyes snap open. It wasn't the rain or the distant sirens. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a sledgehammer hitting wood. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at my tablet screen and felt a cold chill run down my spine. Julian Vane wasn't waiting for Friday. He was standing outside with 3 men in hard hats, and they were already starting to tear down the wooden hoarding that protected the edge of my alley. He was using the chaos of the accident as a cover to move in early. He was going to bulldoze my home while the police were still busy directing traffic a block away. And the worst part was, I saw him hand one of the men a heavy canister of gasoline. He wasn't just going to tear my house down, he was going to make sure there was nothing left of me or my secrets by the time the sun came up. I spent the rest of that night in a place Julian Vane didn't even know existed. Beneath the streets of this city, there is a whole world of old maintenance tunnels and forgotten sub-basements that haven't seen a human footprint since the 1950s. I moved my essentials into a small, dry room behind a heavy iron door that required a very specific sequence of turns to open. It wasn't as cozy as my cardboard castle, but it was safe. I sat on an old wooden crate, the only sound being the distant drip of water and the hum of the city far above my head. I spent hours tending to my hands. The burns were angry and red, and every time I moved my fingers, it felt like 1,000 needles were poking into my skin. I applied the cooling cream and wrapped them in fresh white gauze, using my teeth to pull the bandages tight. I felt like an old soldier patching himself up after a battle that nobody was supposed to know he fought. When the sun finally came up, I knew I couldn't stay underground forever. I had to see what the world was saying. I changed into a different outfit, an oversized gray hoodie and a pair of faded work pants that I'd kept in a vacuum-sealed bag for emergencies. I pulled the hood low over my brow and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The city felt different today. There was an energy in the air, a kind of frantic buzz that you only feel when something big has happened. People weren't just walking to work with their heads down. They were huddled in small groups, pointing at their phones and talking in hushed, excited voices. I walked 3 blocks away from my old corner and found a small electronics repair shop. In the front window, a row of 10 different televisions were all tuned to the same local news station. I stood at the back of a small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk. On the screen, they were showing a loop of the silver Mercedes spinning across the ice and slamming into that pillar. Then they showed the footage that changed everything. It was a grainy, shaky video taken from someone's cell phone. It showed a man in a tattered coat running toward the fire, while everyone else stood back. It showed the moment the door popped open, and the man pulled the woman out of the wreckage just seconds before the explosion. The news anchor was calling me the Angel of Fifth Street. They had a digital artist's sketch of what they thought I looked like, but it was all wrong. They made me look like a saint from an old painting with a neat beard and glowing eyes. They didn't see the grease under my fingernails or the way my knees popped when I walked. They didn't see the man who had spent 30 years hiding from the very spotlight they were now shining on the sidewalk. I listened to the people around me talking. One woman said she hoped they found me so she could give me a hug. A man in a business suit said I was probably a veteran who had fallen on hard times. They were all making up stories about me, turning me into a character in a fairy tale, because they couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of a person doing something good without wanting a reward. Then, the screen cut to a live press conference at the city's main hospital. Evelyn Thorne was sitting in a wheelchair, surrounded by a dozen microphones. She looked tired, and she had a small white bandage over her temple, but her voice was as steady as a rock. She didn't talk about her pain or her expensive car. She looked right into the camera lens and spoke as if she were talking directly to me. She said that she had spent her whole life surrounded by people who wanted her money or her influence, but for the first time in 80 years, she had met someone who only wanted her to stay alive. She announced a $1 million reward for any information that would help her find her mystery rescuer. She said she didn't want to put me in a cage or put me on a stage. She just wanted to say thank you in a way that mattered. The crowd around me gasped at the mention of the $1 million. I could see the change in their eyes instantly. They weren't looking for a hero anymore. They were looking for a paycheck. People started scanning the faces of everyone walking by, their eyes narrow and suspicious. I felt a cold knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. $1 million is enough to make even the best person turn into a hunter. I pulled my hood lower and stepped back into the shadows of a nearby doorway. I realized that my invisibility was gone. Every person in a ragged coat was now a target for the city's greed. I decided to circle back toward my old block, staying in the narrow alleys and behind the delivery trucks. I wanted to see what Julian Vane was doing. When I got within sight of the construction site, I saw that it was a circus. There were police cars everywhere, and a news van was parked right where my house used to be. Julian was standing in the middle of it all, looking like he wanted to scream. He was being interviewed by a reporter, and he was trying his best to look concerned, but I could see the twitch in his jaw. He was complaining that the search for the mystery hero was interfering with his construction schedule. He actually said, on camera, that while the rescue was nice, the city needed to focus on the future and clear out the debris, meaning me, so he could finish his tower. That was when I saw Marcus. My old head of security was standing near the edge of the police tape, talking to a detective. Marcus wasn't wearing a uniform, but he had that look. The look of a man who never stops until the job is done. He was holding a tablet and showing the detective something. I realized with a jolt of fear that he was probably looking at the high-definition security feeds from the buildings I had designed. He knew my gait. He knew the way I tilted my head when I was thinking. He wasn't looking for a homeless man. He was looking for Arthur Vance. He was the only person in the world who could see through my disguise, and he was currently less than 50 feet away from my old hiding spot. I turned to leave, wanting to get as far away from Marcus as possible, but the sidewalk was blocked by a group of tourists taking pictures of the crash site. I was trapped between a wall of people and the very man who could ruin my life. I ducked into a small alcove where a local coffee shop kept its trash bins. The smell of sour milk and wet cardboard was overwhelming, but it was the only place to hide. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the city. I heard the reporters packing up their gear and the police shouting at drivers to move their cars. I heard Julian Vane's voice, loud and arrogant, telling someone on the phone that he didn't care who the hero was. He just wanted the sidewalk cleared by sunset. The sun started to dip behind the buildings, casting long purple shadows across the street. I thought it was safe to move, so I stepped out of the alcove and started to walk toward the subway entrance. I kept my hands in my pockets so no one could see the white gauze. I was almost to the stairs when I felt a strange silence fall over the block. The traffic seemed to stop, and the pedestrians went quiet. I looked up and saw a fleet of 3 black SUVs pulling up to the curb, right in front of the construction site. These weren't police cars. They were private armored vehicles with tinted windows. The doors opened simultaneously, and several men in dark suits stepped out, forming a perimeter. Then the middle door opened, and Evelyn Thorne stepped out. She wasn't in a wheelchair anymore. She was leaning on a silver-headed cane, her back straight and her eyes scanning the street. She didn't look at the cameras, and she didn't look at Julian Vane, who was running toward her with a fake smile on his face. She looked directly at the alleyway where I used to live. She walked past Julian as if he were a ghost, her heels clicking on the pavement with a sound like a ticking clock. She stopped right in front of the pile of crushed cardboard and torn tarps that Julian's men had made. She reached down with her free hand and picked up a small, charred scrap of my old wool coat. She held it for a moment, her expression unreadable. I was standing in the shadows of the subway entrance, less than 20 feet away from her. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I also saw something else, a look of absolute recognition. She didn't just find a scrap of cloth. She found the proof she was looking for. She turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping across the street until it landed right on the dark corner where I was standing. The world seemed to shrink down until there was only the 2 of us. She didn't scream and she didn't point. She just took a single slow step toward me. And that's when I saw Marcus move in behind her, his hand reaching for his radio as he locked eyes with me. He had found me, and there was nowhere left to run. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the subway entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The air down here was thick with the smell of old grease, damp concrete, and the metallic tang of the tracks. But it was the only place left to hide. Above me, the world had turned into a hunt. I could hear the heavy thrum of the black SUVs idling at the curb and the sharp rhythmic clicks of radio chatter from Marcus's team. These men weren't the police. They moved with a quiet, professional efficiency that I recognized all too well. They were private security, the best money could buy, and they were fanning out across the block like a net being cast into a dark pond. I watched through the dirty glass of the subway door as Marcus walked over to a man standing near the newsstand. It was Mr. Henderson, a retired high school teacher who walked his golden retriever, Barnaby, past my alley every morning at 7 o'clock sharp. Mr. Henderson was a good man. He was one of the few people who always looked me in the eye when he said hello. I saw Marcus hold up a tablet, likely showing him a frozen frame from that cell phone video of the rescue. Mr. Henderson tilted his head, squinting through his bifocals. He looked toward the charred remains of my cardboard house, and then pointed a shaky finger right toward the subway entrance where I was hiding. My stomach did a slow flip. I didn't blame Mr. Henderson. To him, helping the authorities find the hero was probably the most exciting thing that had happened in years. He didn't know that for me, being found was the one thing I feared most in this world. I shifted my weight, trying to move deeper into the dark corner of the stairwell, but my knees gave a loud, treacherous pop that seemed to echo in the narrow space. I froze, holding my breath, as Marcus turned his head toward the sound. He didn't move immediately, but I saw his eyes narrow. He was calculating the distance, the angles, and the likelihood of someone being tucked away in that specific shadow. The search was getting more intense by the minute. 2 of the men in suits started poking through the debris of my old home with retractable batons. They weren't just looking for a person, they were looking for clues. One of them let out a low whistle and called Marcus over. They had found my solar-powered battery bank, the one I had hidden inside the double-walled insulation of a refrigerator box. They pulled it out, the wires neatly organized and labeled with the precise engineering shorthand I'd used my entire career. I saw Marcus run his gloved hand over the casing. He knew. He knew no ordinary person living on the street would have the technical skill to build a custom power grid out of scrap parts. He looked at the battery, and then he looked back at the subway entrance with a look of absolute certainty. I felt like an animal being tracked by a predator that knew all my favorite hiding spots. It was a strange, hollow feeling. For 30 years, I had been the one in charge. I was the one who designed the security systems, the one who built the towers, the one who saw everything coming before it happened. Now, I was just an old man with burned hands and a ruined coat, cornered in a subway station by the very people I used to employ. I thought about running down into the tunnels, disappearing into the maze of tracks and maintenance rooms I knew so well. But I knew my body wouldn't hold up for long. My hands were throbbing with a dull, heavy heat, and the smoke I had inhaled during the rescue was making my chest feel like it was filled with lead. Then I saw her. Evelyn Thorne stepped away from her security detail and started walking toward the subway stairs. She didn't wait for Marcus or the others. She moved with a slow, determined grace, her silver-headed cane tapping against the pavement with a steady beat. Julian Vane tried to stop her, reaching out to grab her arm, but she brushed him off with a single, icy look that would have stopped a freight train. She didn't say a word to him. She just kept coming toward me. She looked so small and fragile standing there in the middle of the busy city. But there was a power in her that made the entire block seem to go quiet as she passed. I realized then that I couldn't keep hiding. It wasn't just about Marcus or the money or the secrets I was keeping. It was about the look on that woman's face. She wasn't there to capture me or turn me into a trophy for the evening news. She was there because she had seen a piece of her own soul in the man who had pulled her from the fire. She was looking for the person who had given her a second chance at life without asking for a single thing in return. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt for making her search for me in the cold and the rain. I took a deep breath, winced at the sting in my lungs, and stepped out from behind the heavy metal door. I didn't try to hide my face anymore. I let the hood of my gray sweatshirt fall back, exposing my messy salt and pepper hair and the soot-stained lines of my face. I walked slowly up the concrete stairs, my boots heavy and loud in the sudden silence of the street. I stopped at the top step, just a few feet away from the yellow police tape. The reaction was instantaneous. Marcus froze where he was standing, his radio halfway to his mouth. His eyes went wide, and for the first time in the 20 years I had known him, I saw his professional mask completely shatter. He looked like he was seeing a ghost rise from the grave. He didn't say my name, but I saw his lips move as he whispered it to himself. He took a step forward, his hand trembling slightly, but he didn't try to grab me. He just stood there, paralyzed by the sight of the man he had spent half his life trying to find. Evelyn Thorne stopped directly in front of me. She was so close, I could smell the faint scent of lavender and the sharp, medicinal smell of the ointment on her forehead. She looked at my bandaged hands, then up at my eyes. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look confused. She looked at me with a deep, quiet recognition, as if she had known who I was the entire time. A small, sad smile touched her lips, and she reached out, resting her hand lightly on my arm. The silk of her glove felt incredibly soft against my rough, dirty sleeve. "Arthur Vance," she said, her voice barely a whisper but loud enough to carry in the still air. "I knew it was you. I knew it the moment you spoke to me in that car. No one else has that voice. No one else has those eyes. You've been hiding in plain sight for 30 years, haven't you?" I looked past her and saw Julian Vane. He was standing near his sports car, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He was looking at me, then at the way Evelyn was holding my arm, and then at Marcus, who was standing there like a statue. He was finally starting to put the pieces together. He realized that the man he had been kicking and insulting for months wasn't just some homeless nobody. He realized that the man in the tattered coat was the very legend his father had told him stories about, the man who owned the ground he was trying to build his legacy on. The shock on Julian's face would have been funny if the situation wasn't so heavy. He looked like he was about to be sick. He took a step toward us, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but Marcus stepped in his way with a look that told him exactly what would happen if he moved another inch. The crowd of onlookers was starting to press in, their phones held high, sensing that the story was about to take a turn they never expected. But I didn't care about the crowd or the cameras. I only cared about the woman standing in front of me, and the secret I had kept for so long. I looked at Evelyn and gave her a small, tired nod. "I've been right here, Evelyn," I said quietly. "I just wanted some peace and quiet. I didn't mean to cause all this trouble." She squeezed my arm, her eyes shining with tears. "Oh, Arthur," she said with a soft laugh. "You never could do anything halfway, could you? You couldn't just save my life. You had to remind me why it was worth saving in the first place. But you can't go back to that box now. The world knows you're alive, and Julian Vane is about to find out exactly who he's been messing with." I looked over at the pile of my ruined belongings, and then back at the massive, unfinished tower across the street. The sun was setting, and the glass of the skyscraper was reflecting the deep orange light like it was on fire. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. The hiding was over. The ghost was back. I turned to Marcus and saw the question in his eyes, the question of what we were going to do next. I knew what he wanted. He wanted to take me back to the world of boardrooms and private jets, but I had a different plan. I looked at Evelyn and then at Julian, who was now being approached by two men in dark suits who didn't look like security. They looked like investigators. I realized that the red notification I had seen on my tablet earlier, the embezzlement Julian was planning, was already being tracked by someone else. The cliffhanger arrived when one of the investigators held up a pair of handcuffs and looked directly at Julian, while Marcus leaned in and whispered into my ear that he had found something even more dangerous hidden in the foundation of the tower than just cheap concrete. Something that could bring the whole city down if we didn't act within the next hour. I stood there on the cold pavement of the subway entrance, and for a moment, the entire city of Chicago just seemed to fall away into the background noise. It was just an old man in a gray hoodie, and a woman who looked like she stepped out of a history book about the grandest families of the Midwest. The contrast between us was almost funny if you really thought about it. She was wearing a coat made of cashmere so soft it looked like a cloud, and her silver hair was perfectly styled despite the small white bandage on her temple. She smelled like expensive lavender, and the kind of soap that costs more than my entire weekly grocery budget. I, on the other hand, smelled like wood smoke and wet cardboard. My boots were held together by 3 layers of silver duct tape, and my hands were wrapped in white gauze that was already starting to turn a muddy gray from the soot and the grime of the street. We stood there in the orange light of the setting sun, and the people around us were holding their breath like they were waiting for a movie to start. Evelyn Thorne didn't look at the cameras that were flashing in the distance. She didn't look at the crowd of people who were whispering and pointing their phones at us. She just looked at me with those sharp blue eyes that had seen 80 years of history. She reached into her small, elegant purse and pulled out a leather checkbook that looked like it had been made by a master craftsman. The pen she used was made of solid gold, and it caught the light as she clicked it open. I watched her hand tremble just a little bit as she started to write. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was writing out a check for $1 million, which was the reward she had promised on the evening news just a few hours ago. To her, that money was probably just a drop in the bucket, but to almost anyone else in this city, it was a ticket to a completely different life. The people watching from the sidewalk saw that check, and they probably saw big houses and shiny cars, and a life where they would never have to worry about a bill again. She finished writing the numbers and tore the check from the book with a crisp little snap. She held it out to me, and her eyes were filled with a kind of desperate hope. She wanted to pay me back for saving her life, and she thought this was the only way the world worked. She thought that every act of kindness had a price tag, and that every hero was just someone waiting for a payday. I looked down at the piece of paper, and I saw the long string of zeros. It was a lot of money, but to me it was just paper. I had seen enough of it in my first life to know that it doesn't buy you peace, and it certainly doesn't buy you a good night of sleep. I gently reached out and put my bandaged hand over hers. I felt the soft silk of her glove and the cold metal of the gold pen. I looked her right in the eyes and gave her a slow, tired smile. I told her that I couldn't take it. I told her that I didn't want her money and that I didn't need it. I watched the look of pure confusion wash over her face. It was like I had just told her the sky was green, or that the lake had dried up. People in her world don't turn down million-dollar checks. They don't walk away from a fortune when they are living in a cardboard box. She tried to push the check into my hand again, but I kept my grip firm. I told her that I had everything I needed right here on this corner. I explained to her that I wasn't a victim of some bad luck or a broken system. I told her that I had lived the life she lived for 30 years. I had the big office with the view of the lake, and I had the fancy cars and the people who laughed at all my jokes just because I signed their paychecks. I told her that up there in those glass towers I couldn't hear the city breathe. I couldn't feel the rhythm of the streets, or see the small moments of real human kindness that happen every day when people think no one is watching. I told her that down here, I was part of the pulse of the world. I knew the names of the stray cats, and I knew which streetlights would flicker before they went out. That was my wealth. That was the life I had chosen, and taking her money would just turn me back into a prisoner of the things I owned. I saw the tears welling up in her eyes then. She wasn't sad because I said no, but because she finally understood. She realized that I wasn't some poor soul she needed to rescue. She realized that I was the one who was truly free. She looked at the check in her hand, and then she looked at the pile of trash and cardboard that used to be my home. She asked me how I could live like this when I could have anything I wanted. I told her that I did have everything I wanted. I had my freedom and I had the truth. And right now the truth was that Julian Vane was the one who was truly poor because he didn't know how to build anything that wasn't made of ego and greed. I looked over her shoulder and saw Julian. He was still standing there by his silver sports car, and he looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He was watching the most powerful woman in the city treat a homeless man like he was a long-lost king. He saw the way she was looking at me, and he saw the check that I had refused. He was smart enough to realize that if I didn't want $1 million, then he had absolutely nothing to offer me. He had no leverage and he had no way to control me. I felt a little bit of that old sharp wit bubbling up inside me. I told Evelyn that if she really wanted to thank me, she wouldn't give me money. I told her she should help me finish what I started 30 years ago. I told her that this city didn't need another glass tower named after a man who didn't care about the people inside it. It needed a place where the people who were invisible could finally be seen. Evelyn nodded slowly, and I saw the spark of a new idea catching fire in her eyes. She reached out and squeezed my arm, and she told me that she understood exactly what I was saying. She tucked the checkbook back into her purse, and she stood up a little straighter. She turned her head and looked at Julian Vane with a look that was so cold, it probably could have frozen the puddles on the street. She told him that his permits were being reviewed, and that his funding was being questioned by her bank starting on Monday morning. She told him that she was going to make sure that not one more brick was laid on this site until the truth about his foundation was brought to light. Julian tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. He just stood there with his mouth open while the cameras caught every second of his humiliation. It was the most satisfying thing I had seen in years. But then the moment was broken by Marcus. My old head of security leaned in close to me, and his face was pale. He wasn't looking at the cameras or at Julian. He was looking at a small handheld device that was beeping with a low, persistent sound. He whispered to me that we didn't have until Monday. He said that the sensors I had placed in the ground 6 months ago were all hitting the red zone at the same time. The weight of the heavy equipment Julian had moved onto the site during the accident was the final straw. The old underground stream wasn't just shifting the soil anymore, it was washing it away. He told me that if we didn't get everyone off this block in the next 10 minutes, the entire intersection was going to collapse into a sinkhole and take the Vane Legacy Tower down with it. I looked at the hundreds of people standing around us with their phones, and I realized that the real disaster was just beginning. The ground underneath my feet didn't just vibrate. It groaned like a tired old giant waking up from a long nap. I could feel the deep, heavy thrum of it through the soles of my duct-taped boots. Marcus was standing right next to me, his face the color of dry cement as he looked at that little beeping device in his hand. He wanted to scream at everyone to run, but he was waiting for me to give the word. He still looked at me like I was the boss, even though I was wearing a hoodie that had seen better decades and smelled like a campfire. I looked at Evelyn Thorne. She was still holding that $1 million check out to me, her hand shaking just a little bit in the cold wind. The paper was fluttering like a trapped bird, and I could see the ink of her signature, bold and elegant, sitting there like it was supposed to solve every problem in the world. I reached out and gently pushed her hand back toward her. My bandaged fingers felt rough against her soft skin, but she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. I told her that money was just a weight I didn't want to carry anymore. I told her that $1 million wouldn't buy me anything I didn't already have. I had the stars at night when the clouds cleared, and I had the respect of the stray cats that lived behind the bakery. I had the quiet peace of a man who didn't owe anyone a single thing. But I told her there was someone else who needed that $1 million much more than I did, and they needed something even more valuable than money. They needed their dignity back. I told her about Maria. Maria was a woman who had lived on this block for 40 years. She ran a little place called the Community Pot. It wasn't a fancy restaurant with white tablecloths or silver spoons. It was a basement kitchen where anyone could get a hot bowl of soup and a piece of bread for $2, or for free if they didn't have the $2. Maria knew every kid's name and every old man's favorite story. She was the heart of this neighborhood. But when Julian Vane started buying up the block for his legacy tower, Maria's little basement was in the way of his planned underground garage. Julian didn't just offer to buy her out. He knew she would never leave her people behind. So he used his high-priced lawyers and his friends at the city planning office to play a dirty game. They sent inspectors in every single week. They found tiny cracks in the wall that had been there since the Great Depression and called them structural failures. They claimed her soup was a health hazard because she used vegetables grown in a community garden. They buried her in fines and legal paperwork until she couldn't breathe. Then, the final blow came. Julian had someone plant a lie about her, saying she was stealing from the very charity funds that helped keep the kitchen open. It was a complete fabrication, but it was enough to get her evicted and her name dragged through the mud in the local papers. Now, Maria was living in a crowded shelter 3 miles away, her spirit broken and her reputation in tatters. I looked Evelyn right in the eye, and I could see her heart breaking as I told the story. I told her that if she really wanted to thank me, she would tear up that check and use her power to make things right for Maria. I told her I wanted Maria's name cleared on the front page of every newspaper that ran that lie. I wanted the city to give her back a space where she could cook her soup and look her neighbors in the eye again. I wanted Julian Vane to have to stand in front of a judge and admit exactly what he had done to a woman who had never harmed a soul in her life. Evelyn's grip on my arm tightened. She wasn't just listening. She was feeling every word. I saw a tear finally break free and roll down her cheek, leaving a tiny trail through the soot on her face. She looked at the check in her hand, the one she thought was the ultimate gift, and she realized it was nothing compared to what I was asking for. She looked at Julian, who was still trying to look important while the world literally started to crumble around him. She told me that she had spent her whole life writing checks to solve problems, but she had never once stopped to look at the people whose lives were being stepped on to make room for the building she invested in. She looked back at me and whispered that she understood. She said that she would make Maria her personal project. She promised that by tomorrow morning, the best lawyers in the state would be working on Maria's case, and by next week, there would be a new kitchen opening up, and it wouldn't be in a basement. It would be a place with big windows and a sign that said Maria's Heart. She told me that I had given her a gift much bigger than her life. I had given her back her perspective. The ground gave another violent shudder, much stronger than the last one. I heard the sound of a window shattering somewhere high up in Julian's unfinished tower. A long, jagged crack appeared in the middle of the street, snaking its way toward us like a black lightning bolt. People started to scream and scramble backward, their phones finally forgotten, as the reality of the danger hit them. Julian Vane was standing right in the path of the crack, his eyes wide with a terror that no amount of money could fix. He looked at the tower he had built on lies and cheap concrete, and he realized it was about to become his tomb. Marcus grabbed my shoulder, his voice urgent and sharp. He told me the sensors were flatlining. The underground stream had finally hollowed out a massive cavern right beneath the intersection, and the weight of the heavy crane Julian had moved in was the final straw. The whole block was seconds away from being swallowed by the earth. I looked at Evelyn and told her she had to get into her armored car and drive as fast as she could. She tried to pull me with her, but I shook my head. I had one more thing I had to do. I had to make sure that the data on my tablet, the proof of Julian's crimes, was uploaded to the cloud before the signal was cut by the falling buildings. I turned and ran back toward the subway entrance, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the roar of the earth opening up behind me, a sound like 1,000 freight trains colliding at once. The smell of gas and old dirt filled the air. Just as I reached the top step, I saw Julian Vane trip and fall, his expensive suit getting covered in the grime of the street he had tried so hard to erase. He reached out a hand toward me, his face a mask of pure desperation, asking me to save him. I stopped for a fraction of a second, looking at the man who had kicked my home and insulted my existence. The final cliffhanger arrived when I heard a massive snap of steel cables above us, and I looked up to see the 10-ton construction crane tilting slowly, directly toward the spot where Julian was pinned by a fallen piece of scaffolding. I had to choose in a heartbeat whether to save the man who tried to destroy me or let the city take back what was hers. I reached out and grabbed Julian by the collar of his expensive suit jacket, just as the first steel cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot. I pulled him backward with a strength I didn't know I still had, dragging him into the mouth of the subway entrance just as the massive crane arm came crashing down. The impact was so heavy I felt it in my teeth. The pavement where Julian had been pinned just a second ago was gone, swallowed by a dark, yawning hole that opened up in the middle of the street. The sound of the collapse was a deep, low roar that seemed to go on forever, a mixture of breaking concrete and the screeching of twisted metal. When the dust finally settled, the Vane Legacy Tower was no longer a dream of glass and steel. It was a pile of broken debris sitting at the bottom of a 50-foot pit. Julian was shaking so hard he couldn't even stand up. He looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have a single word to say. I didn't stay to hear him thank me. I just turned and walked away into the settling white dust, disappearing before the emergency lights could find my face. 6 months later, the corner of 5th and Main looks nothing like the graveyard of broken dreams it was that night. I am standing on the sidewalk, leaning against a clean, new lamppost. I am still wearing a simple coat and a pair of sturdy boots, but they aren't held together by duct tape anymore. My hands have healed, though I still have a few faint scars on my palms that remind me of the heat of that fire. I look across the street, and I can't help but smile. The sinkhole has been filled, but not with the foundation of another cold office building. Instead, there is a beautiful, low-slung structure made of warm red brick and large, inviting windows. It is called the Vance Community Sanctuary. Evelyn Thorne didn't just write a check and walk away. She took my request and turned it into a mission. She used her influence to freeze every single one of Julian Vane's assets the very next morning. Her legal team, which people in this city call the Iron Giants, went to work like a whirlwind. They didn't just clear Maria's name. They found every single piece of paper Julian had tried to hide. They found the emails where he discussed bribing the city inspectors. They found the offshore accounts where he was stashing the pension money he had stolen from the city's teachers. Within 3 months, Julian wasn't just ruined. He was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit in a state facility, waiting for a trial that he has absolutely no chance of winning. His name has been scrubbed from every project in the city, and the Vane Development Group has been dissolved, with its remaining funds used to pay back every person Julian ever cheated. But the real magic is the building itself. I spent weeks working with the architects Evelyn hired, making sure the structural integrity was perfect. I didn't do it from behind a desk in a high-rise. I sat in a small office right on the ground floor, right where everyone could see me. We built a place that has a state-of-the-art medical clinic on the first floor that doesn't charge a penny to anyone who walks in. Above that, there is a library and a learning center where kids can come after school to learn about engineering and robotics. And on the top floor, there are 20 micro-apartments, fully furnished and beautiful, reserved for veterans who need a place to get back on their feet. Every inch of the building is powered by the same solar technology I used for my cardboard house, but on a massive scale that actually feeds electricity back into the city grid. The best part, though, is the corner entrance. That is where Maria's heart is located. It is a bright, airy restaurant with high ceilings and the smell of fresh bread and slow-simmered soup constantly wafting out the door. Maria is back, and she isn't in a basement anymore. She is the executive chef of the whole operation. I watched her this morning as she stood behind the long granite counter, laughing with a group of firefighters who had stopped in for lunch. Her name was cleared on the front page of the city's biggest newspaper, and the mayor himself came by to hand her the keys to the building. She looks 10 years younger, and the light in her eyes is enough to brighten the whole block. She still makes that same $2 soup, but now she has a commercial-grade kitchen and a staff of 12 people who were all hired from the local shelters. As I stand here, I see the regulars from my old life walking by. The young lawyer who used to rush past me with her heavy briefcase stops in front of the sanctuary. She isn't running today. She looks up at the building and then she looks at me. She recognizes me, but she looks confused. She sees me standing there, talking to one of the head engineers, and she sees the way the staff at Maria's Heart waves to me like I'm a member of the family. She walks over, her face a little red, and she tells me she's sorry. She says she used to think I was just a part of the problem with the city, and she feels terrible that she never even asked my name. I just smile and tell her that it's okay. I tell her that sometimes you have to be invisible to see the things that really need to be fixed. Then I see the older gentleman with the golden retriever, Barnaby. He stops right in front of me, and the dog immediately starts wagging his tail and leaning against my leg. The man looks at the building, and then he looks at the bronze plaque near the door. It has my name on it, right next to Evelyn's. He looks back at me, his eyes widening as the realization hits him. He looks at my simple clothes, and then at the plaque, and then back at my face. He doesn't say anything for a long time. He just takes off his hat and gives me a deep, respectful nod, the kind of nod you give to a person you finally understand. He realizes that for all those months, he wasn't just nodding to a homeless man. He was nodding to the man who was quietly rebuilding the soul of the neighborhood from a pile of boxes. A black car pulls up to the curb, and Evelyn Thorne steps out. She looks wonderful. The bandage is gone, and she is wearing a bright blue scarf that matches the color of the sky. She walks over to me and takes my arm, and we turn to look at the crowd that has gathered for the afternoon dedication ceremony. There are hundreds of people there, neighbors, shop owners, and people who used to live on the streets, but now have a roof over their heads thanks to this place. They are all cheering and clapping, and for a moment, the noise is louder than the city traffic. I look over at the spot where my cardboard house used to be. There is a small, beautiful garden there now, with a stone bench and a fountain that trickles quietly. It is a place for people to sit and think, a place where no one is going to tell them to move along. I feel a deep, warm sense of satisfaction in my chest. I spent 30 years building things that were meant to be impressive, but I finally built something that is meant to be loved. I am still the man who knows the secrets of the city, and I am still the man who watches the world from the ground up. But I don't have to hide in the shadows anymore. I watch as the neighbors who used to ridicule me or look the other way now stand in a long line just to get a bowl of Maria's soup and a chance to walk through the doors of the sanctuary. They are looking at me with a mix of awe and disbelief, trying to reconcile the man they ignored with the man who just changed their world. I just lean back against the lamppost and wink at Marcus, who is standing nearby with a satisfied grin on his face. The humble secret isn't a secret anymore, but the real work is just beginning. As the sun starts to set, reflecting off the warm bricks of the sanctuary, a woman I don't recognize walks up to me with a look of pure desperation and whispers that she heard, "This is the place where people can find a miracle when they have nowhere else to go." The community room inside the new sanctuary was filled with the kind of warmth that you can only get from a space that was built with a real purpose. It did not smell like the cold, sterile marble of a bank lobby or the dusty air of a city hall. It smelled like the fresh cedar wood we used for the ceiling beams and the rich, savory aroma of Maria's vegetable beef soup drifting in from the kitchen next door. I sat in a simple wooden chair near the front, my hands resting on my knees. I was wearing a clean navy blue sweater and a pair of trousers that actually fit me, but I still felt like the same man who used to sleep behind a wall of refrigerator boxes. I looked around the room and saw nearly 100 faces. Some were people I had helped, but many were the people who had spent the last few years trying to pretend I did not exist. The meeting was supposed to be a simple neighborhood update, but I could feel something else in the air. It was a heavy sort of quiet, the kind you get when a lot of people are holding on to words they are afraid to say out loud. Evelyn Thorne sat next to me, looking regal and calm, her silver cane hooked over the edge of her chair. She gave me a little wink, as if she knew exactly what was about to happen. I just adjusted my glasses and waited. I have spent 30 years learning how to be patient, so a few more minutes of silence did not bother me one bit. The first person to stand up was Sarah. She was the young lawyer I used to see every single morning during the rush hour. Back then, she always looked like she was running a race she was destined to lose, clutching her leather briefcase and stepping over my legs without ever making eye contact. She walked up to the small podium at the front of the room. Her face flushed a deep shade of pink. She cleared her throat and looked right at me. She did not look at the hero on the bronze plaque outside. She looked at the man who used to sit on a milk crate and watch her walk by. Sarah started by saying that she had a confession to make. She told the whole room that for 2 years, she had viewed me as a problem to be solved. She admitted that she was one of the people who had called the city's non-emergency line to complain about the eyesore on the corner of 5th and Main. She said she used to tell her friends that people like me were the reason the property values were dropping and why the city felt unsafe. Her voice shook a little when she said that she had once even complained to a police officer because my cardboard house was blocking the path to her favorite coffee shop. She stopped for a second and took a shaky breath. She said that the night of the accident changed everything for her. She had been one of the people standing on the sidewalk with her phone out, recording the fire. She told us how ashamed she felt when she realized that the man she had tried to have removed was the only one brave enough to run toward the flames. She looked me in the eyes and told me she was sorry. She said she was sorry for not seeing my humanity, and for assuming that because I had nothing, I was nothing. She thanked me for not just saving Evelyn, but for saving her from her own narrow-mindedness. I felt a lump in my throat as she sat down. It takes a lot of courage for a person like that to admit they were wrong in front of their neighbors. But she was not the only one. Next was Officer Miller. He was a big man with a gray mustache who had been patrolling this beat for 15 years. He stood up where he was sitting in the back of the room. He told us that his job was to keep order, and that often meant moving people like me along so the business owners wouldn't complain. He said he had woken me up at 4 in the morning more times than he could count, telling me to pack up my things and find somewhere else to be. Officer Miller said he always thought he was the one doing the protecting, but then he saw the blueprints for the sanctuary. He saw how I had designed the security systems and the structural supports to keep the whole block from falling into a sinkhole. He realized that while he was busy moving me from one alley to another, I was busy watching over the very foundations of the neighborhood. He took off his uniform cap and held it against his chest. He said he wanted to formally apologize for treating me like a nuisance instead of a neighbor. He said he was proud to walk this beat now, knowing that the man he used to harass was the one who had truly secured the future of the street. The room was silent for a long time after that. I could see other people nodding, their eyes cast down at the floor. These were the shop owners who used to sweep their sidewalks toward my feet, and the residents who used to pull their children closer when they walked past my shelter. One by one, a few more stood up. They spoke about their guilt and their surprise. They talked about how they had judged a book by its tattered cover and how foolish they felt now. It was a powerful thing to witness. It was like a giant weight was being lifted off the entire community. All the hidden resentment and the quiet judgments were being aired out in the open, and they were disappearing like mist in the morning sun. When the last person finished speaking, the whole room turned toward me. They were waiting for me to say something. They were probably expecting me to be angry or to tell them that it was about time they realized the truth. They might have expected me to lecture them about how they treat the less fortunate. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of my years, but also the lightness of my heart. I looked out at all of them, the ones who had been kind and the ones who had been cold. I told them that I did not hold a single grudge. I told them that I understood why they didn't see me. In a city this big and this fast, it is easy to only look at the things that are shining and new. I told them that I hadn't lived on that corner to prove a point or to make them feel bad. I lived there because I wanted to be close to the heart of the world again. And sometimes the heart is found in the places people try not to look. I thanked them for their apologies, but I told them that the best way to say sorry was not with words, but by looking at the next person they see on a street corner with a little more kindness. I told them that we are all just one bad day or one wrong turn away from needing a helping hand, and that a community is only as strong as the way it treats its most invisible members. I sat back down, and the room erupted into applause. It was a warm, genuine sound that felt like a giant hug. People started getting up to shake my hand and to head toward the kitchen for Maria's soup. For the first time in 30 years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I felt like Arthur Vance again, but a better version of him. A version that didn't need a skyscraper to feel tall. I spent the next hour talking to everyone, hearing about their lives and their families. Sarah the lawyer told me she was going to start doing pro bono work for the sanctuary's legal clinic. Officer Miller asked if I could show him how the solar panels worked on the roof. It was a beautiful afternoon, and I felt a deep sense of peace. But as the crowd started to thin out and the sun began to dip below the buildings, I noticed a man standing in the far corner of the room. He hadn't clapped, and he hadn't stood up to apologize. He was wearing a gray suit that looked far too expensive for a neighborhood meeting, and he was staring at me with a look of cold, calculated intensity. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. He didn't smile. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old photograph. He held it up so only I could see it. It was a picture of me from 30 years ago, standing in front of my old company's headquarters. But there was a red circle drawn around the person standing right behind me in the shadows. My blood went cold. That person was someone I thought had disappeared forever the night I walked away from my fortune. The man in the gray suit tucked the photo back into his pocket and gave me a slow, chilling nod before turning to walk out the side door. I realized then that while the neighborhood had made its peace with me, the ghosts of my old life were just getting started. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. For 30 years, my mornings were defined by the sounds of the street. I knew the exact time by the hiss of the city bus brakes at the corner, or the heavy clatter of the garbage truck making its rounds. I used to wake up with my back stiff from the cold, and my ears ringing with the noise of a city that never stops moving. But this morning, I woke up in a room that was warm and still. I stayed under the blankets for a minute, just feeling the softness of the sheets against my skin. It felt strange to have a ceiling made of real plaster instead of layered plastic and duct tape. I looked at my hands, and the scars from the fire were fading into thin white lines. They did not throb anymore, but they were a permanent reminder that my life had changed in a heartbeat. I got out of bed and made a pot of coffee. I have a small apartment now, right inside the sanctuary building. It has a stove that actually works and a refrigerator that does not hum like an old tractor. I stood by the window and watched the sun crawl up the sides of the tall buildings across the street. The light hit the red bricks of our new sanctuary, making them glow like embers. It was a beautiful sight. I saw the first few people starting to gather at the front door of Mariah's heart. They were not looking over their shoulders or trying to hide in the shadows. They were standing tall, waiting for the doors to open so they could start their day with a warm meal and a friendly face. I walked downstairs and found Maria already in the middle of a whirlwind. She had her apron on, and her hair was tucked under a bright white cap. The kitchen was a beautiful place, filled with stainless steel that sparkled under the lights. The smell of onions and celery sautéing in butter was so thick, you could almost taste it. Maria saw me and let out a big laugh, waving a wooden spoon in the air. She told me I was late for my first cup of coffee, even though it was only 6 in the morning. I sat at the small counter and watched her work. She was teaching 2 young women how to make a proper stock. These girls had been living in a shelter just a month ago, and now they were learning a trade that would keep them on their feet for the rest of their lives. Maria was not just feeding people, she was giving them a future. I saw the way she corrected them with a gentle touch, showing them how to hold the knife and how to respect the ingredients. It was a kind of education you cannot get in a fancy school. After I finished my coffee, I headed over to the learning center. This was the part of the sanctuary that made my heart beat a little faster. We had rows of computers, a 3D printer, and a large table covered in blueprints and building models. A young man named Leo was already there, staring at a complicated drawing of a bridge. Leo was 19, and he had spent most of his life thinking he was not smart enough for school because he struggled with reading. But the minute I put a set of tools in his hands or showed him how a load-bearing beam worked, his whole face lit up. He had a natural instinct for how things fit together. I pulled up a chair next to him, and we spent the next 2 hours talking about tension and compression. I did not use big words or complicated math. I showed him how to use his hands to feel where the weight was going. I told him that a building is like a person. It needs a strong core and a way to handle the pressure without breaking. Leo listened like his life depended on it. He told me that he used to walk past the Vane Legacy Tower and feel like he did not belong in this city. He said the glass walls made him feel like he was on the outside looking in. I told him that we were not going to build glass walls here. We were going to build things that people could actually touch and use. We were going to build things that belong to everyone. Around noon, I took a walk through the medical clinic on the first floor. It was a quiet place, decorated with soft colors and comfortable chairs. I saw a mother sitting there with her young son who was getting a checkup. She looked relaxed, not worried about how she was going to pay the bill, or if the doctor would look down on her because of the clothes she was wearing. The nurses and doctors here were volunteers from the big hospitals uptown, and they were all there because they wanted to be part of something real. They told me that working here reminded them why they became doctors in the first place. It was not about the insurance forms or the fancy offices. It was about the people. In the afternoon, I went out to the garden. This was the exact spot where my cardboard house had stood for 3 years. It felt strange to sit on a beautiful stone bench, right where I used to huddle under a tarp to stay dry. The fountain was trickling nearby, a soft and steady sound that drowned out the noise of the traffic. I saw Marcus walking toward me, looking sharp in a simple suit. He sat down on the bench and we did not say anything for a long time. We just watched the neighborhood move around us. We saw the kids coming out of school and heading toward the learning center. We saw the older folks sitting on the other benches, soaking up the sun and talking to each other. Marcus told me that the city council had officially named the block after me and Evelyn. He said that Julian Vane's lawyers were trying to get him a shorter sentence, but the evidence I had collected was too strong. Julian was going to be away for a long, long time. I felt a sense of justice, but I did not feel any joy in his downfall. I just felt glad that he could not hurt anyone else. I told Marcus that I was happy right where I was. I did not want to go back to my old company or my old life. I wanted to stay right here on this corner and make sure the sanctuary stayed strong. As the sun started to go down, the lights of the sanctuary came on. They were soft and warm, making the building look like a beacon in the middle of the busy city. I felt a deep sense of peace that I had not felt in 30 years. I realized that my time as an invisible man was not a waste of time. It was the most important part of my life. It taught me how to see the things that really matter, and it taught me how to listen to the whispers of a city that most people only hear as a roar. I stood up and took one last look at the garden before heading back inside. I saw a man walking by, his head down and his shoulders hunched against the wind. He looked like a man who felt invisible. I walked over to him and asked him if he was hungry. I told him that there was a place right here where he could get a hot meal and a warm place to sit. He looked at me with surprise, as if he could not believe someone had actually noticed him. I gave him a smile and pointed toward the door of Mariah's heart. I watched him walk inside, and I knew that he was going to be okay. My time in the shadows taught me that the most powerful thing you can give a person is not money or a fancy building. It is the simple act of being seen. I spent decades building skylines that touched the clouds, but I never realized that the most important structures are the ones we build between each other. I looked up at the stars, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel like a ghost. I felt like a man who had finally found his way home. Being invisible taught me that the world is full of hidden beauty and quiet strength, and I will never take for granted the simple, wonderful gift of having a name that someone is happy to say out loud.